Well, Michigan has struggled the last 2 weeks. They almost lost to Indiana. That game went into overtime and they won by a touchdown, but they did have their first loss of the season to Michigan State 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and especially a fairly weak Indiana team that is still experimenting with their third-string quarterback.
And Penn State is coming off a bye week, which will serve in their favor.
Yeah, and also playing at Penn State in front of those fans at that stadium, it'll be pretty amazing. It'll be a great atmosphere. Those fans, they definitely want it after not being able to cheer for their team last week. Their defense is the number one ranked defense in all of college football this year. They lead football in most statistical categories so far this year, and the ones that they don't lead in, they're at least top 10 in. Last year, they held Shaquan Barkley, that is, to 59 yards and 0 touchdowns in this matchup. His fewest yards per game, or his fewest yards in any game in the last 2 years. They're also only allowing 2.6 yards per rush attempt this year, which is the best in football.
As far as Penn State goes, they have one of the most explosive and balanced offenses in the conference, led by Trace McSorley, who has thrown for 1,600 yards and 13 touchdowns thus far. But let's talk about the offense in general. The Nittany Lions averaged 456 yards per game, 291 from passing, leaving the leftover 165 yards for the running backs. Defense is key for Penn State. They hold their opponents to 9 points per game. That's arguably one of the best stats in college football right now. They definitely lead in that category. They also only allow 285 yards per game. For third in the Big Ten, they are behind Michigan, though.
Yeah, and the one difference separating these two defenses is Penn State has given up more than twice as many big plays. Michigan has only given up 2 plays so far this year of over 30 yards.
But they also haven't really played anyone except for these last 2 weeks. And Indiana, you can't even say that is a good team, you know?
Indiana is a team that held with Ohio State, though, and, the score being aside, the first half, even the first 3 quarters of that game, Indiana versus Ohio State, were extremely closely contested. Indiana's a tougher team than a lot of people think, and then especially a tougher team than a lot of people give them credit for. And at Indiana, it's definitely not, the toughest schedule by any means. Michigan State is by far the best team they've played. They do lose in the all-time series against Michigan, 13 wins for Michigan and only 7 for Penn State. They've only been playing for the last 20 years in the Big Ten, though. And last year, as I said earlier, Michigan just pummeled Penn State. They won 49-10, and they really shut down their running game. Shaquan Barkley, he was one of the Heisman hopefuls at that point, and that game really shut down his entire campaign. Only getting 59 yards, that's just not something that you can do if you want to be a Heisman. He's definitely going to have to improve on that this year if Penn State has any hope of winning. They do have a fairly balanced offense, but without his explosive plays in both the passing game and the running game, they don't have much of a chance. He is a majority of their offense. He's just under 40% of their total offensive yards. Without him, if he gets injured or if anything happens to him, or if Michigan is able to just lock him down with one of their top linebackers, Penn State really doesn't have many other options. They don't have a number 2. They have a number 1, and then they have some other guys sprinkled in here and there who have the ability to make plays, but they haven't consistently done it throughout the season.
You are right with Shaquan Barkley. If anything happens, Penn State will be suffering, but Michigan is already expecting to target him particularly, maybe even with double coverage.
Yeah, you really have to double cover him now, especially in the passing game. Running, you can only do so much to stop a guy like that. Penn State has a pretty large and beefy offensive line, so he's hard to get to. He generally gets 2 or 3 yards per rush, just completely untouched. But it's the passing game where he's really able to hurt a lot of teams.
And talking about Michigan weaknesses, they struggle with the offensive line quite a bit. The Wolverines may be quick, but the offensive line can't seem to effectively protect the quarterback or create holes for the running backs, making this a relatively easy matchup for the Lions. And then let's talk about the quarterback overall, because if it's a bad day, it all falls on him at the end of the day. And John O'Korn just is not cutting it. He's only thrown for 563 yards after taking over for Wilton Speight early on in the season, but he only throws at 54%, and the interceptions outweigh the touchdowns by 4-1.
Yeah, that's definitely not a stat that you want to have as a quarterback or even as a team in general. It's something that they really have to overcome. I don't think it's going to happen at all this season, but it's something that they'll at least need to, get slightly better at least get it to a 2-to-1 ratio, or even a 1-to-1 ratio is obviously still bad, but at this point, I think Michigan fans will take just a 1-to-1 ratio. My key player for Michigan is Devin Bush. His dad played in the early 90s and was drafted in the late 90s. He's a sophomore at Michigan. He leads the team with 48 tackles and 5 sacks. He's 6 feet, 255 pounds, and he's one of the top linebackers in the entire country. He's going to be tasked with stopping Saquon Barkley, especially when he goes out on routes. He's one of the few guys who can't necessarily keep up with him, but at least be fairly close behind him. He has the agility, he has the speed, quickness, and physicality to, help in the run game quite a bit. That's why he does lead his team in both solo and assisted tackles and sacks of the year. He's going to be a pivotal player in stopping Saquon Barkley and just the Penn State offense in general.
Well, my key player of the game is Saquon Barkley. He's going to be looking to run over Devin Bush multiple times. So not only does this junior running back have more receiving yards than the actual receivers, but he currently holds the highest QB rating in the league at 564 after completing one pass that resulted in a touchdown. And on a more serious note, though, he runs 40 yards in 4.3 seconds, giving him the speed to explode through the holes that his offensive line creates, for a total of 649 rushing yards this season, accompanied by 6 touchdowns. But he also performs very well on the wing, gathering 395 yards for an additional 2 touchdowns. Aside from that, he also contributes 258 yards for the special teams when it comes to kick returns.
Yeah, and especially as a bigger back weighing around 220 pounds, that speed is really unheard of. It's something that you can't find very often.
This is another tough pick, but I think I'm going to go with Penn State just because I feel like you said earlier, they have that 2-for-1 punch. Michigan does struggle offensively, and defense will win games, but you have to have an offense that can put points on the board. Now, they have been putting points on the board, but it hasn't been pretty. You don't need pretty to win games, but I think Penn State is going to contest Michigan, especially with the weak strength and schedule they've had this season.
I also have Penn State winning this game fairly easily. I think it's going to be a fairly low-scoring affair, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if Michigan gets shut out in this game. And that's all for this week. Tune in next week and watch the rest of our episodes. I'm Griffin Parkrose.
And I'm Janae Muchmore. Don't forget to follow us on social media at redtoend.com or like us on Facebook. You'll see a couple of our episodes for this week along the right-hand side of your screen. Have a great night.